I made a video a year or two ago discussing my transition to Windows as my daily driver operating system, and using Windows Phone as my primary mobile operating system. It's been a couple of years and there have been some major changes both in my views, or at the very least my personal level of tolerance on privacy, and in the software that I'm using to get work done every day. So I thought I would make an update video talking about my transition back to Linux on the desktop. I wanted to give Windows a try for two main reasons. First, I legitimately liked my old Lumia 640 Windows Phone. It offered a sleek, easy-to-use alternative to Android at a time when Google had just been sued in, I think, Germany for capturing data packets from private Wi-Fi networks and all kinds of other things. I had tried out Ubuntu Phone, and while it looked nice, it was missing a lot of features and apps that I actually needed. Second, I had just built a PC primarily to use for gaming, and at that time, the only way to play every PC game natively with ease was with Windows. I had used Wine in the past, and it always turned into a convoluted mess of manually setting up custom Wine installations, dealing with all the weird fonts and context menus that Wine adds, all just to play a few games. And to be fair, I did have a great time gaming on Windows. But over the past year or two that I've used it as my daily driver, I came to realize why I loved Linux and free software in the first place, and I started to realize that my self-inflicted love for all things Microsoft, while temporary, was perhaps a bit misguided. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about what platforms I've switched to, why, and the things about Microsoft products that led me to leave Microsoft behind. Again. First, on the mobile front, I've switched to Android. I actually took a hardware downgrade to manage this. I've very seriously considered getting an iPhone, and still am, but there's very few, if any, good options for getting a decent iPhone for a reasonable price that isn't used or refurbished, and with Android there's tons of options at a wide variety of price points, so there's a lot more freedom of choice when it comes to hardware, so I've just always stuck with Android primarily for that reason. My first Windows phone was a Lumia 640. It shipped with Windows 8.1. I later upgraded it to Windows Phone 10, and it was a great phone. The apps looked sleek, the phone was responsive and had a decent camera. Alas, I forgot it on the roof of the car one day and didn't remember until I saw it go flying onto the road behind me and get ran over. I insisted on sticking to the Windows Phone ecosystem and found an Alcatel Idol 4S for $150 on Amazon. The same exact phone with Android was something like $400 at the time, so I jumped on the deal. The Idol 4S was an amazing phone with a much better camera. However, at this point, some issues that I had begun to notice later in the life of my Lumia began to crop up more prominently. The operating system seemed overall less responsive and stable. There was one update in particular that seemed like it hurt the phone more than it helped. Apps that used to work started disappearing left and right from the store, or just stopped functioning properly due to a lack of updates. Even my bank pulled their app listing from the store. For a while, you could manually visit the old URL and install it anyway, but one day after an account transfer of mine failed to execute properly and I called them to ask about it, they actually updated the app with a disabled version that would simply tell the user to visit their mobile website. So I had to pin a browser shortcut to the mobile website to my desktop as a sort of replacement for the official mobile app, although you couldn't do things like scan checks using the mobile web page. Apps continued falling off, the operating system itself became more and more unstable, sometimes just straight up crashing when I tried to do anything remotely exotic, like make a phone call. Yes, my phone literally froze and crashed when I tried to make phone calls, multiple times. I found myself fighting with my device more than I was using it to actually get things done. When I got a Nintendo Switch for my son, I discovered that in order to properly make use of the parental controls, you had to use the Nintendo Switch Parental Controls app on Android or iOS. Even Cortana, the digital assistant that I had become accustomed to using on my Windows Phone to dial numbers or send texts or navigate to a location without having to distract myself by looking at the device while driving, was being rapidly outpaced by later arriving competitors like Alexa and Google Assistant because of Microsoft's lackadaisical approach to adding features and making it competitive. It's even gotten to the point that Microsoft has stopped referring to Cortana as a digital assistant, instead referring to it as a digital assistive. So basically, Cortana is a modern-day Clippy. So I decided to move back to Android. I picked up a Nokia 3.1 for about the same price that I paid for the far technically superior Alcatel Idol 4S, about $150-ish. Its hardware inferiority aside, the experience was much better, if for no other reason than because developers actively supported it with their apps. So I was all of a sudden able to properly set up parental controls on my kids' Nintendo Switch consoles, use my bank's mobile app to scan in checks, and even use the official app for Discord to chat with friends in-game. Side story, the only app I could find for Discord on Windows Phone was an unofficial one, and not 48 hours after logging into it, I got a two-factor authentication notice in my email inbox where somebody in another country had tried signing into my Discord account. One reason I chose the Nokia 3.1 is because it's an Android One device, which means zero pre-installed crap from the phone manufacturer, and supposedly earlier security updates straight from Google instead of having to wait on everything to get blessed off on by my phone carrier. But yes, I'm using a product from Google. Yes, I'm still highly suspicious of their behavior, both in the past and today, because I know for a fact that the way they sustain themselves is through data mining and advertising. But it is an unavoidable truth that in order to accomplish certain tasks, I have to either have an iPhone or an Android phone, and I can't bring myself to pay for somebody else's old used throwaway iPhone or to pay $1,000 plus for a new one. So at least for now, Android it is, and I'll just try to take every precaution I can to safeguard as much data as possible on the device. On the desktop PC side of things, however, I've transitioned back to Linux, Ubuntu to be specific. I built this desktop PC a few years ago with gaming specifically in mind, and to be honest, for that task, it's been awesome. At the time that I built it, there was no good way to play the vast majority of Windows games on Linux. Yes, you could install Wine, but it brought with it all kinds of fonts, context menu entries, and just all kinds of things that it did to your system, a lot of which got left behind even if you uninstalled it, and most of which I didn't want sitting on my system just to run a handful of video games. I was so annoyed with the way Wine functioned that I would rather just not play a game or not run Linux than to do a normal uncontained installation of Wine. Now, it's important to note that my home server has this entire time continued to run Debian Linux. It's not like I completely cut Linux or open source out of my life entirely. In fact, I would even drop into the Ubuntu or Debian IRC support channels and offer assistance once in a while, even though I was running Windows at that time myself. I love Linux and open source software, but for whatever reason, maybe it was just morbid curiosity, I decided to give Microsoft a pass for the sake of being able to game on my PC. Over the course of the past year or two, though, that I used Windows on my PCs, several things came to my attention that eventually pushed me back into using Linux on my PCs. I say PCs plural because it was also running on my wife and kids' computers. The funny thing is, my wife, who is the one who hasn't worked in the IT field before, was highly skeptical about using Windows on her PC when I built it because she had just learned to love Linux in the past. First, and this is actually a big one, was advertising being built into paid software. I paid the full $100-ish price tag to Microsoft for my own Windows 10 home licenses to use on these PCs. See, paying for software is something I don't really have a problem with. If you put the time and effort into creating something, and I get use or enjoyment out of that product, I've got no problems paying you. In fact, over the years, I've even donated to multiple open source projects because I thought their products were useful enough to warrant some sort of compensation. However, I feel like once I pay for it, my copy of that software is mine to do with what I want. I should be able to see it in its entirety and customize it to suit my needs. I even felt this way while running Windows on my PCs, even though I knew it wasn't true of Windows, because not only is Windows proprietary, but Microsoft even goes out of their way to lock certain features of their software behind a tiered paywall, so that even if you pay for it, if you don't pay for the right version, certain features won't be available to you. Anyway, I paid for Windows, and what do I see upon installing it? 2 different versions of Candy Crush, Fitbit Coach, Netflix, along with several other third-party apps and games, or at the very least, links to them. It reminds me of cable television, where you pay for the service, but you still got to sit through commercials. I mean, seriously, look at this. This is a screenshot from a bare-bones stock install of Windows 10 Home. It's using a local user account that's not tied to a Microsoft account. All I did was install Windows, create the local user account, and install available updates. This is the type of crap I would expect to see pre-installed on an HP laptop circa 2005, which is supposedly the type of negative user experience Microsoft is trying to move away from with their Surface hardware. But instead of it being a third-party OEM loading all sorts of crap onto your system right out the gate, it's Microsoft themselves. For the purpose of editing videos, I paid for a copy of Cyberlink Power Director, and to be fair, it is a decent video editor. But immediately after installing the paid-for version of the software, I noticed that there were ads built into it. While it was encoding a video, you'd be treated to a little built-in advertisement for their sound editing software or seasonal special effects packs, or a year or so later, the newer version of Power Director. They weren't in the video you were rendering or anything like that, but there was advertisements built right into a piece of software that I paid more than a couple of dollars for. I felt like I was constantly being extorted for more and more money and getting proprietary, non-free products in the process, and the only way to continue getting use and enjoyment out of these products was to continue spending money. Second was the increased unpredictability and instability of updates coming down the pipe from Microsoft. There was, of course, the infamous Update 1803 that broke all sorts of things for all sorts of people. Then the Update 1809 that randomly deleted users' files, and which Microsoft actually retracted before re-releasing. I'll post links in the description to articles about those issues. When I first read about these problems people were having, I just kind of chalked it up to chance. There's always a chance that developers are going to miss something over the course of building an update. Linux projects are not immune to this. But the proliferation of major problems seemed odd, especially given how much money Microsoft makes. It's not like they're hurting for the money to pay good developers and QA testers. Then one of the problems hit me, or more specifically my graphics card, a Radeon RX 480. I had been using my HDMI audio device to send audio through my display to speakers I had attached to the display. It had been working absolutely fine for some time, a year or more prior to the update, and now all of a sudden my HDMI audio device was listed and even appeared to be working. The little green meter in the sound settings would jump up and down when I played an audio file as if it was producing sound, but nothing was actually coming out of my speakers. I tried uninstalling and reinstalling my graphics card drivers and everything. Strangely, my USB-connected Corsair headphones would work fine, but something about the update to Windows that Microsoft pushed out broke HDMI audio on a fairly common gaming graphics card. I just read an article earlier today, actually, outlining the severe degradation of performance in 3D accelerated applications like games that comes with a recent update to Windows. It was something to do with the mouse pointer causing extreme lag spikes. I'll put a link in the description to an article about it. Gaming is one of the major reasons people, including myself, even bother using Windows on the desktop. It was just becoming more and more apparent that I couldn't depend on Microsoft to offer me a consistent, secure, and stable user environment. Third was a lack of locally configurable parental controls on Windows 10. For those who don't know, parental controls in Windows 10 are tied to your Microsoft account. You can't create local accounts for your kids and then exercise parental controls on them using built-in features of Windows 10. You have to create child accounts for your kids and add them to your Microsoft family and then manage the parental controls through the Microsoft family website. This isn't a huge problem except for the fact that, going back to Cortana, Windows Phone, and other Microsoft ventures, they have a bad habit of creating a useful product, releasing it, and then just canning it if it's not an instant success. And having the parental controls run through a Microsoft website constantly had me wondering, what happens if they decide to discontinue this service? Will I have to pay for a third-party software to do the same thing? Microsoft has put out a number of products in the last decade, hyped them, got users on board just to sit there and let the product flounder because they weren't willing to continue putting time and effort into improving the product after it was released. And it's enough to actually make me afraid to try anything new Microsoft makes because I don't want to get invested in using it and then have it go away and have to move on to something else because it wasn't an instant success. Fourth was the classic spying fear. I did a video a year or two ago where I Wireshark tested a Windows virtual machine. My primary goal in that video was to examine the claims that the radio buttons did, quote, nothing. Spoiler alert, they work. So I Wireshark tested the box with most things turned on, then Wireshark tested it with most things turned off, and compared the amount of data that I captured. The amount was far too immense for me to really examine each and every data packet sent. However, I recently added the Pi-hole software to our Debian home server. For those who don't know what Pi-hole is, it's basically a DNS service that filters internet traffic. You configure your router or individual devices to use it as their only DNS server, and then whatever it lets through, it forwards to the provider of your choice, like OpenDNS, but it blocks access to URLs that are on any of several lists of advertisers, malicious sites, trackers, etc. I installed the software, left it running a few minutes, and then went and checked the query log to see what kind of stuff was going on. This interface gave me a much more useful information than Wireshark did, if for no other reason than because it organized it and didn't list every single packet coming and going. So there was a lot less to sift through. Not 10 minutes after installing Pi-hole, when I checked the query log, it had blocked multiple attempts by all of our Windows PCs to contact a variety of addresses, and my PC was just idling at the desktop, not doing anything. I started searching some of these addresses to see what they were, and a large number of them were Windows telemetry data. Like I said, my PC was just sitting at the desktop. Nobody's machines had crashed or had issues, but they were trying like crazy to send telemetry data to Microsoft. Check out this screenshot. I just created a brand new Windows 10 virtual machine and created a local user account. All Windows updates are installed, Cortana disabled, and all of the radio buttons regarding privacy were turned off during the installation process. I logged into the virtual machine, set a 30-minute timer, and then went back to working on other things. These are all addresses that machine attempted to connect to that were blocked over the course of that 30-minute time period. Out of 57 queries, 16 of them were blocked. Now, telemetry data is all well and good on its own, and obviously this brand new virtual machine doesn't have any information on me even if it wanted to send it off to our evil corporate overlords. If a component of Windows crashes or has a problem, I've got no problem whatsoever with sending data about that issue back to Microsoft so they can fix the problem. And to be completely fair, it has been shown in the past that Microsoft has actually fixed bugs based on telemetry data that they collected. So telemetry data is not by itself some evil mechanism for spying on end users. But when a computer that has all the boxes for information sharing unchecked is still continuously trying to connect to addresses like watson.telemetry.microsoft.com, things start to look a little bit odd and made me feel a little bit suspicious, especially given the numerous other issues I had encountered over the past year with advertisements built into paid software, random hardware glitches caused by official Windows updates, etc. For comparison, here's the records for a bone stock, up-to-date VM of Ubuntu 18.10, also over the course of 30 minutes. The green ones are normal and were allowed through. Notice there's no red. It syncs the clock, checked for updates, and checked for connectivity. That's all it did in that same block of time that Windows 10 was going crazy trying to send up telemetry data. Hell, in Windows, I would often go manually click check for updates to make sure I had the latest security patches, not knowing that by doing that manually, I was actually enrolling myself into a sort of beta program where I would get updates that other people wouldn't get, potentially breaking my stuff. I just wanted to make sure I had the latest security patches, not beta test Microsoft broken updates. I'll post a link in the description to an article talking about this very thing. I'm still not 100% convinced that Microsoft does any sort of covert spying for the purpose of harvesting user data like Google does. But as my experience with Microsoft products continued to go downhill, I was less and less willing to take a chance on that, especially at the cost of my own freedom when it comes to how much access I have to the software I pay for. Then my mind wandered back to something I'd heard about months back, a little Valve initiative called Proton. For those who don't know, Proton is Valve's own fork of Wine. It's open source, and they are updating and tailoring Proton to improve compatibility with Windows games. It translates DirectX functions to Vulkan, and best of all, it doesn't require you to install Wine yourself, any of its fonts or anything. It creates a sort of containerized environment for each individual Windows game you install. I had messed around with it early on during one of my earlier attempts at moving back to Linux on the desktop, and actually had success with Doom 2016, although with Debian I had to do a lot of fiddling with pulling in new kernels from backports and things to get my Corsair keyboard and mouse and my graphics card working correctly. I decided to use myself as a testing ground for a week or so. I decided that since I had historically had problems with Debian, mainly because of how old the software and the stable release is, that I would try out Ubuntu since it's based on Debian, but has historically had better hardware support. I was pleasantly surprised to find that Ubuntu has ditched Unity in favor of a customized GNOME shell, which is one thing that I loved about Debian. I was even more pleasantly surprised to find that all of my accessories just worked out of the box, including my Corsair keyboard, mouse, and graphics card. I tried out Steam and played a handful of Windows games with Proton. I found locally installable parental control software called TimeKPR, and upon testing, even noticed slight improvement in the performance when doing things like encoding videos with Handbrake, possibly due to the lower overall CPU usage of the operating system itself. I was gaming, working, and doing everything I needed to do in Linux. It was stable and consistent, so I asked my wife how she felt. And although it shouldn't have been a surprise to me, she was ready to jump back onto the Linux train, so I migrated all 4 of our PCs over to the latest version of Ubuntu Linux. Their systems all run generally as good, or in some cases better than they did with Windows. I did notice one interesting thing. Both of the kids' PCs are using duplicated displays, in that they have a small regular computer monitor and their television hanging on the wall. And those 2 displays are duplicated by the PCs themselves. The television is connected via HDMI, and their monitor's connected via DVI. In Windows, one of my son's Lego games, I think it was Lego Batman or one of those Lego games on Steam, would not run correctly with the displays being duplicated. So I had to go set it to only show on one display or the other if you wanted to play that game, even though it had the latest graphics drivers and everything installed. However, that same Windows game running with Proton on Linux works just fine being duplicated to 2 displays. So a month or 2 in, I remembered video editing. I don't do it often, but on the rare occasion that I do want to make a YouTube video, I need something to do some, at the very least, basic editing. And in the past, I'd had consistent issues with OpenShot crashing, transitions wanting to show like a black frame and then sort of fade into the next clip instead of blending the 2 clips together when I try to do a transition. I didn't feel like I needed something as powerful as, say, Blender, but I just wanted a simple timeline editor to let me do things like add titles and transitions, mute clips, the normal, simple things that you do when editing a video. I tried editing a video in OpenShot just the other day, actually my video about building the pie hole, and the experience was pretty bad. First of all, it used insane amounts of RAM just in the editing process, averaging like 11 to 13 gigabytes of RAM just editing the clips, not encoding the video, just the editing process. It crashed twice while I was editing the video, and one of those crashes erased the contents of the project file, which meant my previous 2 hours of edits were just gone. Then it crashed twice more while actually trying to export the video I had edited together. It never successfully completed an export. It would get to like 50% and then just crash. It got so bad with the sluggishness and the crashing that I was manually creating a backup copy of the project file every now and then, just in case it died and took the project file with it a second time. I was almost to the point of installing Wine just so I could see if my paid-for Cyberlink Power Director would run in Wine. But I decided to do some poking around and see if there was any other good, easy-to-use, timeline-based video editors to help somebody like me throw together some clips with some transitions here and there. I came across a video by the Linux Gamer where he mentioned using Kdenlive, and in searching for Kdenlive in the Ubuntu store, I found another one called Shotcut that was available as a snap from a verified developer, so I figured I'd give that a shot. It took some reading to find the features I wanted, and to be fair, I still found a bug or two that I'll remember to work around in the future. But it was a far better experience editing in Shotcut than it was using OpenShot. I edited the video about building a Pi-hole with ease, no crashes, a fraction of the memory usage during editing, far better performance while editing, and it supports hardware encoding. I'm gaming, including Windows games. I'm editing videos. I'm doing everything I need my PC to do in Ubuntu with free and open software. My kids are browsing our Plex server, playing their games, and playing old emulator games I set up for them. Now, to be fair, not every Windows game works flawlessly in Proton, but quite a lot of them do, and given my love for open source software and the numerous, almost systemic problems I had with Microsoft products over the past few years, I'm glad to be using Linux on the desktop again. So, it's Ubuntu Linux and Android. I might take a hit once in a while on compatibility with Windows games, but at this point, I think I would much rather take that hit and have a secure, consistent, stable experience on our PCs with the increased level of control that comes with Linux and open source software. I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about my experience over the past few years and my transition back to the world of Linux. Hopefully those of you who stuck around this long have at least found the video somewhat informative. As always, this is Marcus out. Y'all have a good one.